All right. So let's see. What is my first question here? I have a little bit of a questionnaire. Um, would you say that there is a typical approach that you follow in identifying topics for research?
So, as I mentioned in my email, I mean, large part it's happenstance. Things happen, and people are debating a particular issue, and we don't know the answers. But broadly speaking, whenever I think about this more systematically, and for example, when I'm speaking to a student just about to do their doctoral thesis proposal, I suggest there are three things that should be considered. The first thing is there a theoretical debate which is really worthwhile, which is going on in a contemporary situation where there's more than one perspective and where we don't know the answers? So we're really looking at issues where a contemporary event has happened, for example, the rise of authoritarian populism, or in the case of the book we referred to earlier, the development of the internet and the consequences for democracy, or issues like backsliding in democratization. So there's a debate going on about contemporary events as they unfold, and we don't know what the answers are going to be. And ideally, what one wants to find at the beginning of any project is two or three potential ways to frame those answers, maybe from previous eras, previous literatures, different social science disciplines, alternative methods, whatever it is. So there's a genuine debate, not a false debate. And too many people start off with, this is my argument and here's a kind of straw person. No, I think you really need to be sufficiently empathetic to different arguments to think them through and to be potentially genuinely persuadable, skeptical at the beginning that one of those theories is going to work, but you don't know which one. Secondly,
Hmm.
you then need to have essentially doability. So you get an awful lot of theories which are just untestable, is God in existence, etc. And as an empirical political scientist who believes in comparative politics, I'm therefore looking for ways to do this, often with existing data, not necessarily gathering new data. I find there are so many resources which are underutilized. For example, the World Values Study is an enormous survey with over 100 countries. The number of people who use it to work on their country, Canada, Mexico, whatever, is enormous. The number of people who use it to answer interesting questions is really quite small. And then lastly, as well as that, as I'm in the policy school, and in general, I do believe it should have policy relevance. So again, we can talk about angels on a pinhead for APSR until the cows come home. But what you really want is an issue where there's genuine problems in society, in politics, in democracy, in communications, in gender politics, you name it, but where your work is going to resonate to a broader audience, a broader readership, and will get out there, ideally in many different countries, as not just in one country, but really resonate in terms of potentials of what could be done to fix or to at least address understanding for social problems.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that sounds really, really reasonable. Let me ask you this. When you start a project, do you generally have the feeling that you know what you're going to find, or do you start out in a state of relative ignorance? Like,
So
I've got an interesting question, but I'm not sure what the answer is.
as I said, John, what you really need is two or three theories, debates. So there are answers always in this existing literature to a range of what we're looking at. For example, if you're looking at that current issues of backsliding and authoritarian resurgence, this isn't the first time, according to Huntington, we've had three waves. Can anything tell us from Huntington's work or others, for example, Johan Lintz's classical work, or others about resurgences of authoritarianism, for example, in the 1980s? Or do those theories not apply? And if you can say, well, look, you don't want a shopping list of a dozen theories because then you have no impact and you can't address them thoroughly. You can't just start with one theory because basically, if you start with one theory, it can be quite a strong way of approaching things. And certainly some scholars like that. But I find you're becoming too dogmatic in a way, and you're not open to learning from what you're finding. You're just basically asserting and claiming and discounting irrelevant evidence. If you start off with two theories, then you've got a debate and you've got to be open-mindedness enough so that by the end of the book or the study or the article, you know which theory seems more plausible. But again, you've got new questions which arise from every one that you address. So it's a combination of knowing something but not knowing everything. That's the key for interesting research. And if you know what your theory is and what you're going to find, then why are you doing the project? There's no point.
Right.
Right?
Right.
We're not.
Well, unless
We're
you
not.
feel that something hasn't been sufficiently demonstrated and other people
That's
don't
not a good
agree with you.
argument. I mean, that's every single PhD student says this is a neglected topic. Well, who cares? It's neglected for good reasons. I mean, I actually say that to them because they're often coming from a particular context. So somebody from Malaysia wants to talk about electoral reform in Malaysia or whatever. But unless you've got a bigger resonance, unless you can actually reach a broader audience which is going to be interested in those issues, then and that means basically thinking about what people are having a conversation about and engaging in the conversation.
Hmm. Is it your feeling that a lot of, or at least some dissertations are a little too narrow?
Absolutely. This is one of my key peeves about both the profession as it's emerged and about a lot of PhD dissertations, although it does depend on the context. Um, but often what happens, for example, I'll give you my Australian colleagues in Sydney and elsewhere. What they try and do is find something that nobody else has done anything about, which is just nuts. It's the worst sort of way to think yourself. So what you do is you go down to the bottom of the well and you find a little area that nobody has written about, Sydney local government in 1865 or something like that. And you think that's going to be original. Well, of course it isn't. Originality comes from having it's like a game of tennis. You're hitting the ball back to people who you disagree with or you agree with, but you're having an interaction, you're having communication which is a two-way street, if you like.
Hmm.
So anything which is too narrow, too specialized is very bad training for the discipline as a whole, because nowadays we do need the flexibility to be able to move around the discipline rather than again going down tunnels and silos. Um, and we need to be able to do that in our teaching, absolutely. And we need to be able to do that intellectually. I think for all three reasons, we've become far too specialized across the disciplines.
Hmm.
This is partly methodological, and it's partly the size of the profession and the size of the discipline. Think about the 1960s versus what we do today. Or think about, for example, how, again, I'm British, as you can tell, as well as being American, and I was trained in Britain. And there was much more of a generalist assumption, which then you could apply to lots of different topics. Now, there are obviously trade offs. Some level of expertise gets lost if you become too much of a generalist and you try to do everything to everybody. On the other hand, the most interesting things for me have always been at the intersections and topics which I've got very little background on, but I can apply certain ideas from one discipline or subfield or topic and then apply it to another where there just hasn't been those connections. And
Hmm.
that for me is really the most interesting part of the job.
Hmm. And if you were to, think back over your career, you've had quite a number of works with big impact. Is it possible for you to articulate why you were able to make a certain um, statement point, that that resonated with the field? Does it have something to do with that breadth, or is there some other trick of the trade that you
Well,
have?
again, um, it's not so much a trick of the trade, but I'm quite conscious that the way I write and what I do is somewhat different to mainstream in political science in America, for example.
Mm,
Both graduate students and many others are focused on articles. I do articles, I publish in various journals, but my life is really a bit more of a marathon. It's about books. And I do think that books give you the room and the space to make more of an impact if they hit the right note, i.e., they're theoretically resonating, they have good data, and they have public policy impacts on a topical issue. Articles, I find frustrating. It's rather like a 100-yard sprint. And by the time you've set out, here's what the other people have said, here's the literature review, here's the methods I'm going to use, here's the data, here's my measures, here's my findings, here's the robustness of my findings, here's my conclusion, they tend to be somewhat too specialized and thin.
hmm
So obviously there are some which have had tremendous impact and have become seminal, the classics. But if you think about the numbers of average citations on most articles, it's really sad that so much effort goes into these and so little citation impact comes out of them because, again, people are specialized and
Right.
reading very narrowly. And people don't necessarily know how to also market and disseminate their work in various ways,
Right.
which
Do
we can come back
you?
to.
This is sort of a side note, but
Yeah.
do you think that the advent of Google Scholar and other citation um, uh, databases making the citation count more prominent is changing the way people think about their research?
Hopefully. And again, I've done this for years, and so it's all become part of what's known as the research assessment culture in Britain and Australia and various other places. Here, it's much more subtle than that in the way that people grade scholars, but nevertheless, citation impacts are increasingly important. And what they're doing in the past, it would basically be, what's your output? Are you producing n number of articles, n number of books, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
in order to get tenure or to get other forms of citation recognition? Nowadays, we're increasingly looking not just at citations, but also broader indicators of impact. For example, the ESRC, the European Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, looks for user indicators when you put in a grant application. And so you can't simply address the political studies of the world. You also have to make sure that somehow a cabinet office or Department of State or users in civic society or whatever, you want to be able to demonstrate some broader impact on more than just your colleagues. And I think that's healthy. I think, again, we're somewhat inward looking and we've become more inward looking over the years for various reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And we should be more outward looking. And citations are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Some people are cited because they're wrong, of course, not because they're right. Some things get cited because they hit a nail on the head at a particular topical time. One thinks of things like social capital in the 1990s, other things like Huntingdon, the Clash of Civilizations. But when you're on what you might term, topics kind of have a natural, normal curve. And some of them are going up and some of them are going down. And some people are putting all their efforts into a topic which is kind of on the way down. It's been done to death. We kind of know the answers and it's much less relevant today. Others get in on the ground floor of a topic which is moving up. Specialists on, for example, Tunisia or Egypt during the Arab Spring have a ready market to talk about those sorts of issues.
Mm-hmm.
People who focused on populism for years and years, Cas Mudde, who's done work on this since the 70s and 80s, suddenly is positioned where that topic takes up.
Yeah.
And it's often, by the way, politics which drives political science, not political science which drives politics. So when there's an event that happens which is extraordinary, is having tremendous impact, think of the literature on terrorism after 9/11, etc. That gives you the public audience for solid academic research and for reaching a bigger audience than you would in a normal course of events.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that, and I like that idea of a sort of a normal curve, and I'd actually like to be able to measure that somehow. I bet that one could.
And again, John, that relates to the digital divide. So
Right.
that was the book, which was strange because it has the most citations, and I have not written a single thing really seriously about the internet since the book.
Mm-hmm.
It was a one-off. It came about partly because we had a workshop at the Kennedy School. Joe Nye, who was brilliant at thinking about new topics as developing. So we brought together people from all the different disciplines represented. We're interdisciplinary in the Kennedy School. And I wrote something for him on the digital divide that was a topic in the period.
Mm-hmm.
And the book came out in 2000. And the internet started in 1995. With the Mosaic and various other visual browsers, as we know it, Netscape and so on. So I was doing something at the beginning of an upturn. And I still vividly remember some colleague in some conference standing next to me and saying, you're doing work on the internet. Do you think that's going to survive? So it was kind of going to go away the next day. And I was always just curious. And I'd been in the Schornstein Center that focused on communications, and I had written a book on communications before then, Virtuous Circle, that's also widely cited. But the digital divide just struck me as all of those things. In other words, it starts off with three theories about what might be happening. It might be cyber optimist, it might be cyber pessimist for society and for democracy, or it might be no effect, that kind of arguments. And then I went through a whole bunch of different sorts of evidence. And that framework lasts, even though it's amazing how the literature has gone on by leaps and bounds. I don't even follow it, but I know that everybody's working on that in great detail, but they can still relate to the original framework. And because it was very early on, it set an agenda. Can I just give you one quick little example,
Absolutely.
which
No,
was
I'm loving the examples, so please.
the working paper I wrote on whether it was economics or whether it was cultural backlash on Trump and on authoritarian populism. So remember what that paper was called? It's called Trump, Brexit, and the Rise of Authoritarian Populism. At least I think that's what it's called. I have to check. But anyway, now the fact is the article, the paper, really has nothing on Trump. I wrote it I wrote a little op-ed in the Washington Post Monkey Cage in March 2016. I thought what I was saying was pretty obvious, which was that Trump was just part of what was going on more generally. Remember, we hadn't even gone through the primaries then, but it seemed to hit a chord, and there were lots and lots of people in the Washington Post who, clicked it, liked it, went viral. So then I said, okay, I'm giving a plenary talk in July. So I quickly wrote up the paper, and it was really like it was like one of those things that just kind of flowed. And I gave the initial results in July 2016, and then I gave it again in APSA in August 2016, similar paper, somewhat expanded. And I posted it as a working paper, and I never published it. And yet, when I just checked, it has 800 citations. And it has that because it sets out a framework of how to think about this phenomena. It sets out some arguments. It sets out some evidence. Certainly, I was using in that particular European Social Survey as an incredible resource to think about some of these issues and to look at these parties. And the argument resonates. Everybody kind of gets it as soon as you think about it. And there are arguments on both sides. It's a genuine debate. So many great scholars have looked at evidence on things like the decline of municipalities and counties across America according to their economic patterns, and say, yes, Chinese manufacturing, when it hits manufacturing industry, produces support for Trump. Others have looked at European evidence as well along similar lines. And others have looked at the cultural issues and said, no, it's race, it's ethnicity, it's authoritarian values, it's whatever. So it's an ongoing, genuine debate, and it will continue to go on. But it's because I got in, I think, on the ground floor before Trump was even elected. Because the title resonated, because I put it out on the Kennedy website and also on the social science citation website, sharing of papers, and the blog had gone viral. So it just got out there. And it's not because it answered questions. It didn't. It gave an argument. And of course, then I spent 2 years with Ron working on the book, which was far more difficult. But, that took forever.
Yeah.
But if you get the right timing, the right
Yeah.
topic,
Well,
and the right argument.
right. I appreciate that. And I'm thinking that there's maybe some kind of strategic advice that we can all benefit from. That, there seems to be this concern that people are going to steal our ideas, but maybe we should be more concerned. We should look at that as a blessing. You put your ideas out there and other people cite them, and that way we contribute to an ongoing debate. And whether something is formally published or not is maybe less important nowadays.
And indeed, what I do when I give a talk like at IPSA or at APSA is I look for the criticisms, because those are so helpful, because then they say, oh, yes, well, I didn't answer that. How can I do that better in the next piece I'm writing on the topic, right? So I'm always giving chapters of books as I'm writing them as talks everywhere. People are always inviting me for plenary, this, that, and the others. I don't really like to give a talk once it's been published, because for me, what's the point of just telling people what they can read? So I'm always wanting to give about the next book, not the last book, which is really difficult because people always ask you to give a talk on the last book, not the next book. And by the way, people have very different strategies. So some people are very good at marketing, give the same theme everywhere, and they're known for that. Other people give different things, and they're known for that.
Yeah, I think
I cover more ground than
right. I think that's quite true. Would you say that you are someone who has a sort of a big theory or framework that is consistent across your work, or yeah?
No. I'm problem oriented. All my work has that, and I'm empirical, and I'm comparative. And I'm basically a comparative behavioralist, but also an institutionalist. And I'm also somewhat multidisciplinary. For example, I've written in the sociology of religion, I've written in gender studies, I've written in communications, and people know me from each of those. but they also know me from political science. So,
And let me follow up on that too, because in looking at your career, at your over, it's true you do cover a lot of different areas. I think you were one of the first people
absolutely,
to
most
write
people don't.
about women in politics in a systematic way.
That's right. 1978, my very first book. And I wrote, again, in the early years on political representation. Again, that model, which we used in a book called Political Recruitment, which was just on Britain, is now used today all the time. It's a supply and demand model. And more or less every article you pick up on representation and gender and other forms of representation starts with supply and demand as a framework. Because it clicks, everybody gets it,
Right.
right? So I think the data, the evidence is there, but that isn't what counts. It isn't what people doesn't basically what I do, John, is I think address important questions rather than give clear answers. My answers are more like semicolons than they are full stops.
Okay.
I can give you
That's good. It's a good metaphor.
another way of thinking about that. My Critical Citizens book, is widely cited, right? That's an edited book. It's also a book which, when we had the workshop, which Theda came along to, she said, "Oh, this will never turn into a book." But anyway, it's become one of the most cited ever. If you ever do any work on support for democracy, attitudes and trust, everybody cites Critical Citizens. And the reason why is simply that at the end of that book, what I did was I said, well, there's two ways of thinking about what we've been looking at for the evidence. One is that obviously the increase of criticism and skepticism and mistrust is a sign of challenges and problems for democracy, because it can lead to disillusionment, apathy, etc. And another one is it's very positive. It means greater cognitive skills. People are thinking about the issues more. They're not just loyalists, but it's a sign of changes, not decline. And again, everybody picks up on that. I didn't prove either way. I simply laid it out. And the same is true also of my Virtuous Circle book. At the end of that, the conclusion says, well, there's two ways of thinking about what we've just found. I've gone through a massive evidence on the impacts of communications. And here's two ways that you might want to think about it. One is that there's a virtuous circle, and the more you read, the more you watch, the more you listen, the more informed you get, the more engaged you get, and the more it's easy for you to participate. That's the positive spin. And then the negative one is that you get a mean world effect, and you get negative news, and you become disillusioned, and you stay home, etc., etc. Now, I could not prove from all the evidence I used, it was quite extensive. I used a lot of work from Eurobarometers and various others. I couldn't prove which of those was correct, because that actually requires a different type of data. It requires understanding the individual using experimental work or panel surveys of the same individuals and all sorts of things over time. But I laid out those two arguments, and ever since, again, people pick up those two theories and say, well, which is supported? And often the one I linked towards, which was the virtuous circle one, i.e. it's a positive impact, is often nearly always proved in the empirical work. So give people not one answer, but a couple of ways to think about the problem, and you get cited. If you have too definitive an answer,
Okay.
why would you bother to cite it?
Okay. Let me ask you a little bit about the many topics you've worked on. I'm somewhat similar that way. Do you feel that you move on to new topics because you've said what you have to say about that topic, or how do you view that?
I view it a bit
Is
like
there
a
some?
circle. So you work on a topic extensively for a particular period, for a book, for a project, and then you feel you've done it. For example, my electoral integrity project, I generated 3 authored books and numerous edited books and articles and data sets and so on. I feel that I've kind of done as much as I can on that. And so, despite the fact I continue to be invited to write about that, I'm now onto a different topic. But what I do is, after, say, 10 years, I then go back to the original, because then new things have happened, new events, new literatures, new research, new data, and look at it again. So it's more like I go around in circles, but I put them down for a while and then pick them up again later on when it's again become more interesting, or you have new ideas or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And how do you, if there's a typical way, how do you find? Maybe I'm re-asking the same question, but like if you look back at your CV over time, do you see a kind of a trail from one to the other, or are these things that you discovered at different points? Oh, that would be interesting. Now I'm going to do that, as opposed to some kind of logical
I don't
development.
have a plan. I don't start off to say, in the next years I'm going to write on X, Y, and Z. I have ideas, and I try always to focus. People often ask me, it has to be said, why I'm so productive. And what I say is, I try to have one project at a time. So many people seem to be in this perpetual anxiety crisis because they're trying to do 10 articles, which it just kind of pulls you apart. And each one comes back to you after 3 months, and you have to get that back in, and then you do it again, etc. If you have one book or a particular project which you're just focused on for that year, and then you give talks in conferences whenever they invite you, or a workshop, or a professional meeting, or a public event. You give a talk on work as it's developing from a chapter, so you actually get helpful feedback to shape your ideas and get them better, and incorporate the ideas of critics and steal wherever you can all of those good suggestions. Then you're kind of focused, and that allows you to do a few things around that topic. Often a chapter might well become suitable for a book, for a edited book, or for an article or anything like that. But I find the startup times for projects is quite a lot, and therefore it's really in particular because I do lots of different areas of the field. So I don't want to accept 3 different things that somebody's invited me to which don't relate to the key thing I'm working on this year, whatever that this year is, whatever that topic is
Yeah.
this year. And people seem to have a lot of, I forget what it is, what we call it, where people basically have no focus, no concentration. They're just doing 10 things.
Yeah. It's
They're trying to
multitasking.
multitask, absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think the tendency towards articles, not books, has exacerbated that, partly because of the delay. I just can't stand it when I've written an article and I put it to bed and I think I've intellectually kind of tied it up in a bow. Then it comes back with suggestions for revision, but I'm onto something else. And going back in is almost as worse than starting it off in the first place.
I I feel exactly the same way. It's the most dismal part of our
And
profession
then you
that
have to revise it
you
because
just
the
have to.
reviewers have said, why didn't you do what I did? And you lose your vision, you lose what you wanted to say. A book gives me freedom. And you obviously are still having reviewers and you still have processes to get through. But nevertheless, it gives you, for me, a year-long piece of work to run
Mhm.
and to work with.
Is Yeah, I mean, this it sounds like a great advice, particularly for book writers, because one has much more control over the process
Absolutely.
in a
And
book.
it's so much more economical. Basically, the shape of the structure of a book is the same as the structure of an article. But, for example, you can have in an article, by the end, when you're actually telling people about the findings, you've got a couple of pages at most. With everything else that you've done to wrap it all up and tell people and explain it and footnote it and etc. In a book, you can put your methods and your data explanation into one chapter, but then each of the subsequent chapters builds on the previous ones. It's cumulative. And therefore,
Hmm.
again, it's like a normal curve. The first part of a book is difficult. Once you get to the middle part, you're kind of cresting the hill, and then cycling down the end of the hill is easy because you've got the foundation you've already established. Um,
Hmm.
so it flows, if you follow.
Is there a? I'm thinking of book writing. Is there a typical process that you go through with kind of identifiable stages, or
So,
is every
so
book
of course,
kind
every
of?
writer has their own way of doing things, etc. So I do have my routine, which I find works for me. Um, the first thing is always that basically when I'm writing, I want that sustained. So summer, right now, I'm writing a new book which is called In Praise of Skepticism. I'm doing it with a couple of colleagues, Jerry Stoker and Will Jennings in the UK. Um, so I like to wake up on a nice, clean, clear day like today and basically get to work. And I want to be able to read what I've just written. So I always, at the end of the day, print out what I've done on that chapter. And then I start the day by reading it again. And it's amazing how overnight things fall into place. Things you got stuck on the night before are easy the next day. I just opened a chapter and it was far too long. It was 12,000 words. And I suddenly realized that a whole section of it, 4,000, I could cut out and put into the previous chapter, and then everything flowed better. The previous chapter was too short and so on. So that kind of routine, I think, helps. And being really
Hmm.
undistracted and being disciplined enough not to take on all of those travel requests. I'm doing an awful lot
Yeah.
electronically now and not
Yeah.
traveling because it just takes not just a week from your time, even to go to Europe, as you know, but then it's the break in your concentration, which takes another week or so to get back in. So you've lost 2 or 3 weeks over summer just by going to Europe or wherever.
Yep. 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 And in terms of the book as a kind of a series of stages, is there like a time when you're formulating it? Do you map it out?
So
Do you start writing? Do you work with the data
no, no,
first? Do you
no.
have your
You
theory
can't work with the
sections
data first.
first?
That
What?
for me is cheating. Um, Not only does it make a mess of everything, but it means you have no genuine theoretical interest. So the theories have to come first. And what you've got to try and do is work out in the literature what the core 2 or 3 theories are you're going to address. And then you know what arguments are potentially out there. And so, again, I'll give you the example. In Praise of Skepticism, the new book says, okay, there are 3 mainstream ways of thinking about trust. One is psychological, it's about the individual, and that's a classic argument. It's a personality trait, and therefore it's kind of inborn or learned early, and it's fixed and durable, and it's an affect, it's an emotion. And you grew up trusting in Sweden, you grew up cynical in Italy. Second theory is that it's sociological, it's to do with the society you grow up in and your early formative years and the culture, and therefore it's generational. And so trust should be shown by different birth cohorts. The third argument is it's more based on rationality, Russell Hardin, and therefore it's an idea that it's about informed choices and decisions in your expectations of how agents are going to respond to you to further your interests and to defend your utilities. So you've got 3 arguments, and we're arguing in favor of the last one, but we're arguing about it in relation to the other 2 mainstream ways of thinking about it, which are kind of stylized, rather simplistic, but immediately everybody can get it. And then what we've
Hmm.
got to be able to do is to demonstrate how much of the subsequent work, which is based on the new wave of data from the World Values Survey, which has got, would you believe now, 500,000 respondents when I pull all my data, and the pooled European Social Survey. So I've got a wealth of data, and we've got, excuse me, we have an airplane.
That's okay.
We hardly ever get airplanes, or never once that I noticed. But anyway,
I'm not on a,
there we go, it's gone away.
yeah.
So we also have focus groups, and we also have experimental work, and we have new survey data, and we have bells and whistles, and we have a couple of £1 million from the ESRC, etc. Anyway, so if you can get you and your authors and collaborators to agree on the theoretical framework, that's the most difficult. And I tell you why it's the most difficult, John. It's because everybody's thinking in terms of the old frameworks that they've been trained in. And so breaking out to think more, to break out of the mold, to use it, to really think for yourself rather than thinking about what did civic culture say or what did Inglehart say or what did whatever. We use these theories as crutches often rather than actually using them as launching pads. And so we've got a new way of thinking about it, which all of this, by the way, builds on my previous critical citizens and my democratic deficits, which was 10 years ago now, no, 20 years ago now. So I've come back to the topic, but we've got a new way of thinking about it, which, in a nutshell, it's this. We're always decrying the loss of trust. We hear that every single day in every single area you think about. But in fact, too much trust is as problematic as too little trust. And one thinks about cases, whether it's in Azerbaijan or in Russia or in Venezuela or in Turkey or in America, where there's too much trust, which is based on affect, and not enough skeptical trust, which is based on informed judgments of performance. So we have an idea, we have an argument, and then we set out the research design, and then we kind of unpack it in the different stages, normally with a nice simple heuristic model. So I know what the kind of dependent variables are and the alternative ways to test those explanations. And then I'm genuinely open to seeing what the evidence says. And because you've also set out 3 classic arguments about why trust might emerge, um, when you get to the evidence, one of them is going to win. In other words, if you set off with one theory and the data refuses to behave and it all goes in totally the opposite direction, you just kind of throw it down and the poor old PhD student says, oh God, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? If you start off with three strong big theories which are out there, which everybody is familiar with, but which you can expand and use some data to really go back to those classic issues, even when they're from the 60s or the 70s, then you can basically know that one of them is going to have more support than the others. So it's kind of a rival combating between different ideas, different notions, different frameworks, different theories, tested as far as you can, but not testing everything because you can't test everything,